Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew March, and today I'm going to be presenting on Texas ecoregions. I'm the county extension agent in Polk County for AgriLife Extension, and I kind of focus a lot on natural resources and wildlife and stuff like that. So that's why I always give information. And just a little bit more about me, since I know most of y'all listening today probably don't know too much about me. I come from an agricultural background, cattle, row crop, hay, but I have a formal education in wildlife and fisheries, rangeland ecology, and natural resource management in general. So that's kind of where I fall on the educational aspect of this presentation. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And like I said, we're going to be talking about Texas ecoregions today. And I will say that this is kind of one of my favorite topics. So I do get kind of long-winded on it sometimes. So I do apologize for that. And you'll see that this is I think a pretty fun topic, because we're just going to take a road trip through Texas and see what all the different cool places we have here in the state. So before we get into the what I call the funner part of this presentation, just a little bit, I guess, definition background is what is an ecoregion? And I'm not going to read all these different definitions. Y'all can go through and read this, but in a nutshell, an ecoregion is basically an area with like things. So you can say an ecoregion is an area that has all the same plants in it, like one forest type. Or if you're more from a geological standpoint, an area that was maybe a mountain range that was created by the same geological practices. And then it's really depends on the source that you get it from, as you can see from these different definitions we have here today. But just like I said, in general, it's a large area that's defined by stuff that's equal. And really, when we're looking at an ecoregion, it's smaller than what we would call a biome or a bioregion, which would be a large area. So, a biome we would consider like all the Arctic one biome. So the Arctic in North America, the Arctic regions in Eurasia and Russia, that would all be one biome. And then an ecoregion out of that could possibly be the Arctic regions in North America would be one ecoregion, and then the Arctic regions in Eurasia could be another ecoregion. But then an ecoregion is larger than you could say maybe different ecosystems within a watershed. So let's just say, for practical purpose, you could say the Brazos River watershed in Texas was one ecoregion, but it would be above, like maybe you'd see different habitats compared to the upper parts of the Brazos watershed compared to the lower parts down by the coast. So like I said, you have different factors that go into defining ecoregions or drivers of ecoregions. And this is just a list of some of the more common drivers. For today's presentation, because I think I focus a lot on plants and wildlife and what kind of flora and fauna are out there, because that's kind of what is of interest to me. And temperature and precipitation drive that a lot. Yeah, soil, hydrology, geography, altitude, oceans, macroclimates, that all drives what kind of plants and animals you see out there. But in general, especially when we're looking at Texas, a lot of it has to do with how much precipitation you see, and then temperatures. And that's one trend I want you to pay attention or notice when I do this presentation throughout it is, and most of y'all probably know this, the further east you go in the state, the higher precipitation you have. The further west you go, the lower precipitation you have. So when you go across Texas from east to west, you see a really good gradient going from forest, where we get a lot of rainfall, to tall grass prairie in the central part of the state, to eventually short grass prairie, because we're getting less rainfall, to eventually desert. And then north to south, we see a temperature gradient also, but it doesn't affect the plants and animals quite as much as precipitation. So like I already said, we're looking at a precipitation map here of Texas, and you can see, obviously, Texas's ecoregions are going to vary greatly, because when you're in the southeast part of the state and you're pushing 60 inches of rain annually, compared to out here in El Paso where we're 6 or 8 inches of rain annually, that's obviously going to have effect on your plants and animals and what your ecoregion is going to be. Obviously, an ecoregion out here in Southeast Texas is going to look different than out here in West Texas. And here's a temperature map of Texas. And the main takeaway from this is most of Texas is what we consider temperate. So it's not a cold climate. It's not a hot climate. I mean, a lot of people like to argue that we don't really have seasons here in Texas, which is true when you compare to maybe like the Midwest or the Northeast, but we still have a summer period for the most part, and then a winter period, and then maybe a short fall and spring. So that's why that we would consider most of Texas temperate. You do see when you get up here in the Panhandle, you start getting some colder winters that lead to a little bit down here in the far southern parts of Texas, we get into more subtropical climates. Freezes are very common up here, multiple day, even week-long below freezing temperatures, compared to the valley where freezing is almost, happens maybe once or twice a decade, if that. So when I'm doing this as a live presentation, this is where I ask the people in the audience, what do they think Texas is? Because I think Texas is kind of like the old saying goes, really is like a whole nother country, or Texas is really a country on its own, because our ecoregions really don't really match up with any other state, just because we're so large for one part, and then also because where we sit at in North America, and you'll see that on the next couple slides. But back to this, I'll ask the people in the audience, what do they think Texas is? Is it a southern state? Is it a western state? And usually the common answers I get is a southern state, or a southeastern state, or a western state, or a mountain state. And it kind of depends on where you are in Texas. If you're out here in the mountains, then a lot of people will consider it more of a western state, compared to where I'm sitting at today here in Polk County in East Texas. We really consider Texas part of the South. So it really is like a whole another country on its own, because it's really not like any other state. And you'll see this on the next two slides, where we look at biomes of the world. And if you look over here at Texas, you can see in the lower 48, we have about, according to this map, about, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 6 of about these 7 or so major biomes that we see in the lower 48 can be found here in Texas. You really can't say that for any other states. Most other states maybe have 1 biome, 2 or 3 at the most. So here's a little bit closer up view of the biomes here in North America. And from this map, again, you can see Texas really is unique compared to all the other states, that we have grasslands, we have eastern deciduous forests, we have evergreen forest in the far east part of the state, but we also get deserts and even a little bit of the Rocky Mountain evergreen forest here in the far western parts of the state. And the other thing I want y'all to pay attention to this map is how many, all these different biomes lead to a lot of different ecoregions in the state. And like I said, that has to do, one, because we're at a crossroad between the east and the west, and we're also at the crossroads between colder temperatures in the northern parts of North America, and then the subtropical temperatures down in the Central America. And it also has to do with our large distances of how far it is from east to west across the state. But you can see we have pretty much all of the major biomes in North America, except for the Arctic biomes and the boreal forest up here in the far northern reaches, and then some of the chaparral and the Pacific forest in the Northwest. Like I said, so what is Texas? Well, Texas is really unique because we have all the major biomes that most people consider in North America, except for chaparral, which is restricted to California, the coastal forest of the Pacific Northwest, and then obviously the tropical biomes of Central America, and then the Arctic and boreal forest of the tundra areas. So, but I really don't think that, there's no other state that we see in the eastern part of the state, grasslands that you would associate a lot with the Midwestern and the Plain States, desert ecoregions that you see in the desert Southwest, and even what we call montane forests, which would be like some of the forests you see in the higher elevations of the Rocky Mountains. And like I said, what I want y'all as we're going to cover a lot of material in this presentation. I don't expect y'all to remember all of it, but I want to cover a lot of material so that you can see the general trends in Texas as we cover the ecoregions. And as like I said, as you go from east to west and your precipitation decreases, you go from pine forest to deciduous forest, then to tall grass prairie, midgrass prairie, short grass prairie, and then desert. And like I said, north to south, you see stuff more adapted to sub-freezing temperatures in the northern part of the states compared to tropical plants and animals down in the lower valley in the far deep South Texas. For the most part, most of our ecoregions will follow these two trends, east to west and north to south. We do kind of see some outliers, and we'll cover those towards the end of the presentation. The ecoregions that I'm going to define in Texas today isn't going to follow this Gold's Ecoregions of Texas map specifically, but this is a good map that most biologists, conservationists, land managers use to define the ecoregions in Texas, and it does a very good general job. And I think it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It has 10 major ecoregions in Texas compared to the source that I'm going to use today for my presentation that has 11 ecoregions in Texas. So it follows it pretty similar. But this map that I'm showing y'all now, was put together by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. I guess it was more than a decade or two ago at this point. I'm not sure off the top of my head. But they went through in all the states and they did a really in-depth analysis of the ecological regions, and then they divided them up between what they call level 3 ecoregions, which in this map would be the dark black lines, and that corresponds pretty well to the Gold's ecoregions that we looked at in the previous slide. And then they have what they call level 4 ecoregions, which divide the broader ecoregion up into smaller details. And this is the reason why I like to use this source when I'm talking about ecoregions in Texas, because Texas is so broad and has so many unique areas that when we divide up into these level 4 ecoregions like the EPA did on this map, we see some different trends, and we're going to briefly touch on that. So for this presentation, we're going to look mainly at the level 3 ecoregions, which is, like I said, is followed by this dark black outline, but we're going to briefly touch on some of the smaller level 4 ecoregions just because they offer some unique habitats for some of the plants and animals we see in the state. Now on to what I consider the fun part of this presentation, or what I think most people enjoy the most. So we're going to take a road trip across Texas, and we're going to go through all the ecoregions that I showed in the previous slide. And you're going to see we're going to have a trend here. We're going to talk about general characteristics, some of the land use, and some of the special issues that are concerning on with these ecoregions. Then we're going to look at some of the sub-ecoregions, just kind of list them out. Then we're going to show a lot of different pictures and just kind of show you the vast diversity that Texas has in its landscape and geography, and then in its flora and fauna. So like I said, we're going to start in the far east and work to west, so we go along that precipitation trend, and then there's going to be a couple ecoregions that don't follow that trend, and we'll do that at the end of the presentation. So when we start off in the far eastern part of the state, most of the people in Texas would call this the Piney Woods, obviously, because this is where we find the pine trees at. Technically, it's called the South Central Plains, and that includes pretty much the extension of the southern pine belt. So the piney woods that we find in East Texas is pretty similar to the piney woods you see across the South, all the way up into Georgia, the Carolinas, and even parts of Virginia. So the piney woods in Texas isn't necessarily unique from other states in the South, but it's the far western extension of it until it doesn't receive enough rainfall and the pine trees can't survive. For the most part, soils in this part of the state are very sandy and acidic, which is kind of unique because a lot of areas in Texas actually don't have acidic soil. So, but that is one characteristic of the piney woods. Because of it being piney woods and the soil being acidic, most of it has remained as forest land, and there's very little cropland, and most of that is actually seen along the Red River Valley in the far northern eastern part of the state. Historically, this would have been a pine and hardwood forest, obviously. So you would have had pine savanna in the upper reach outside of the watersheds, and then down along the rivers, you would have hardwood forest. Most of that has been logged out over the years. Very little of it remains. And so nowadays we no longer have a savanna, pine savanna, which would have been historically here where fire would have maintained that habitat, and it would allow for more of a grass herbaceous understory and a more open canopy. Now we see a lot more thicker pine forest. So we replaced the historical pine savanna and hardwood forest with either farmland or loblolly and shortleaf pine plantations for commercial pine production. Here's a map. So for each ecoregion, we'll show you a map so you can kind of get an idea where we're talking about. Basically, we run from northeast Texas along the Red River Valley to just west of Tyler, and then it kind of follows the Trinity River down to Huntsville, and then just north of Houston and Beaumont back over to Louisiana. When you divide out the piney woods or the South Central Plains, the main things to know is depending on where you were at, depends on what kind of pine trees are dominant. So in this 35A, kind of north of Nacogdoches, you see a lot more shortleaf pine compared to what we call this 35E, which is what a lot of people would call the longleaf pine area belt. This is where we historically saw a lot of longleaf pine in the state. And then you get in down to the flatwoods in the far, just north of Houston and Beaumont. That was kind of more common for loblolly to be down in the flatwoods. And this is also the flatwoods is where we see, is where the big thicket is located, for y'all that are aware of that. And then for the EPA, they divided up some of the floodplains are unique enough and broad enough that they're kind of a unique ecoregion on their own to support their own unique hardwood forest. So that's why you see the rivers kind of out divided out. When you look at what the plant life looks here in East Texas or in the piney woods, typical pine savanna, this one's has a little bit of more understory than you'd like to see, but that's kind of what we see nowadays. And then we obviously have a lot of, since we get 60 inches of rainfall in the piney woods, you see a lot of aquatic habitat and a lot of watershed features. So this is Caddo Lake here, the only natural lake in Texas of any considerable size. When you're looking at some of our plants, we have a lot of unique reptiles and amphibians that are adapted to just the piney woods. So one of them down here at the bottom is Louisiana pine snake, which is a very, I don't know if it's the threatened or endangered species, but I know it's a protected species. It's very rare. And the reasoning for that, it's only associated with longleaf pine savanna. And since we've harvested most of the longleaf pine out and we haven't replaced it back because we replaced it back with loblolly and shortleaf pine, it's lost a lot of its habitat. And it's also associated with the prescribed fire or fire that maintain longleaf pine savanna habitat. And just so y'all that don't know, this is a picture of a longleaf pine and what they call the kind of the candle stage. So it looks different than most pine trees when it's younger. And then on the top left this is a red cockaded woodpecker, which is also a protected species that is associated with longleaf pine forest and older stands of trees that are maintained by prescribed fire. And then we see a lot of other reptiles and amphibians in this part of the state, since we see a lot of rainfall that goes along with that. So we get a lot of box turtles. And then to wrap this up for the piney woods, obviously, since we have a lot of rainfall and we said we got a lot of watersheds and aquatic features, this is where you see pretty much the highest diversity of fish in the state. And this guy here is holding the paddlefish, which can be found in some of the watersheds in the piney woods. Now that we've moving on to the next ecoregion, we go a little bit further west, and we lose the pine trees because we don't get enough rainfall. So we have our more hardy deciduous trees, such as oak, some of our oak trees. We in Texas call this the post oak savanna because it's made up of mostly post oak trees, because that's the most hardy tree that can survive out as the rainfall starts to drop out. Again, it's the soil is very sandy, but it has a clay pan underneath it. So that type of soil is not very isn't very good for farming. So this part of the state has very minimal farming, and most of it has remained in either a forest type habitat or it's been converted into some kind of improved pasture. Just like the longleaf pine savanna that we used to see in East Texas, or the pine savannas we used to see in the piney woods ecoregion, the post oak savanna also would have historically been maintained by fires or wildfires. And since fires now lacking from a lot of this landscape, it's really no longer a savanna of little blue stem understory and then post oak and blackjack oak as the canopy. It's really become choked out with yaupon, and we'll see pictures of that later in the presentation. We still see some of the larger watersheds in the state, the Brazos River, Colorado, Trinity, that makes some hardwood bottomlands. But like I said, most of the savanna has been replaced by woody understory. The post oak savanna is just west of the piney woods, but it's going to be east of that I-35 corridor that goes down from Dallas to San Antonio. And it extends as far south as just east of San Antonio and north of Victoria. The Trinity River kind of marks a boundary between the northern post oak savanna and the southern post oak savanna. The only difference is when you get up here in the more northern part, we get a little higher rainfall, so we see a little bit higher diversity of hardwoods, some more elms and hickories and stuff like that, compared down when you get down here to east of San Antonio, where it's just some scrubby post oak and blackjack oak. There is some unique ecoregions within the post oak savanna. This 33C, which is labeled on the map, if y'all ever traveled between College Station and Austin, you kind of notice it's kind of rolling farmland through there, kind of more of a prairie ecoregion. We call that the San Antonio Prairie, or it also marks along the old OSR 21. And then the other unique ecoregion in here, and some people will just include this with part of the piney woods, is the lost pines around Bastrop. But for the people that created this map included it as part of the post oak savanna. This slide really represents what the post oak savanna looks like now, mostly on the left. I know it's not the best picture, but we still have the post oak trees because most of it was only used for rangeland. So it wasn't cleared out for farming. But the yaupon has choked it out compared to, here's a picture on the right, which this is a WMA that Parks and Wildlife has, Gus Engling, and where they use fire routinely to maintain the herbaceous understory of little blue stems. So the picture on the right would be what the post oak savanna would have historically looked like compared to what most of it looks like now on the left. Some of the unique plants and animals we see in this part of the state, the Houston toad, which is another protected species, is found on some of these bogs that are found on some of this sandy soil, especially around Bastrop and College Station, along with the Navasota ladies' tresses, which is a protected orchid, is found on some of the same kind of habitats, sandy habitats. And then the picture to the right is the lost pines around Bastrop, which is just a disjunct loblolly pine forest that's pretty similar to what you would see in the piney woods ecoregion. Now we're going to move out of our forest habitats in the state for the most part, and we're going to get into what we call the prairie ecoregions. The first one's going to be the Texas Blackland Prairie. This ecoregion is what we would call the true tallgrass prairie ecoregion in the state. So when we look at prairie ecoregions, we divide them up between tallgrass, midgrass, and shortgrass, and that's just basically based on rainfall. In tall grass, you get species that'll grow up to 24 to even 36 inches in height or even taller. When you look at mid-grass prairies, you're looking at grasses that are going to top out around 12 inches to 18 inches. Then when you get into short grass prairie, you know, it'll top out around 6 inches in height. The Backland Prairie is kind of a level to rolling ecoregion, but it has very deep, dark soils that are awesome for farming. So most of this ecoregion historically was converted to farmland, and this is where we see a lot of our really good farmland in the state. But it also falls along that I-35 corridor. So what habitat is left is being quickly swallowed up by urbanization due to most of our major cities in the state falling in this Backland Prairie ecoregion. One thing to note is the Backland Prairie ecoregion and a lot of our grassland ecoregions, in fact, have what we call this microtopography. So when you look across the grassland, it might just look like a sea of grasses and there's no real, it's just a rolling or level grassland, but you actually have little depressions and little hills inside of it. And you'll hear people refer to these as pimple mounds or prairie potholes for the lower spots. And basically what that allows is for water to get trapped in one spot compared to a little higher area that dries out quicker. So you'll get little different habitats of plants and grasses and wildflowers within areas close to each other. So the take home message of that is in the Backland Prairie and in our grassland ecoregions, it's not just one solid sea of grasses that are all the same. If you really got down and looked at it, you'd see a lot of different diversity depending on just little subtle differences in geography. The Backland Prairie was home to what we call the big four tall grasses, and that's going to be switchgrass, little blue stem, big blue stem, and Indian grass. Limited woody vegetation. It was all maintained by fire. And because most of our habitat has been lost, most of our native species that would have been unique to this ecoregion have now been lost from the state or just have gone extinct in general. When we look at the Backland Prairie, like I said, it's that I-35 corridor from Sherman, Dallas. Fort Worth is not included in this, by the way. And then we go down to Waco and Austin and San Antonio, all fall right on the edge of it or within the Backland Prairie. That's going to be the northern Backland Prairie. There's also a separate Backland Prairie called the Southern Backland Prairie down here closer to Houston. And that basically runs along between Navasota, Brenham, and then down to north of Victoria. You'll also hear people call this the Fayetteville Prairie if you're ever down in that part of the state, or maybe even the LaGrange Prairie. It's interesting to note the soils down in the Southern Backland Prairie aren't quite as good as in the Northern Backland Prairie. So we converted a lot of this to farmland originally, but then farming wasn't economical because the soil just couldn't hold up. So over time, most of that has been converted back into some kind of grassland, usually improved pasture. So you'll see a little bit more, I guess you could say, intact grasslands in the Southern Backland Prairie than in the Northern Backland Prairie. It's not really the grass as it used to be there, but it's kind of more been converted back to more of a grassland ecosystem. So what makes the Backland Prairie obviously is the black deep dirt that you see here on the left. And then on the right is, you know, typical rolling tall grass prairie. And that's what you would have historically seen in the Backland Prairie. Here's a picture of the big four grasses that I mentioned. Little blue stem on the top left, big blue stem, Indian grass in the middle, and then switchgrass on the far right. This is an artist representation of what the Backland Prairie used to look like in Texas. Obviously, if you drive down the I-35 corridor now, it doesn't look like this at all. You're not going to see herds of roaming bison or prairie chickens or even bobwhite quail for that matter, hardly. Definitely won't see no wolf chasing after bison, but we still do see some of these species, especially on the plants or on the bird side, scissortails, meadowlarks, some of our wrens, and then some of our reptiles. But a lot of our larger fauna obviously have been lost from the Backland Prairie. Now, you know, you probably caught me, if you remember, I said that once we got out of the post oak savanna, we no longer were going to have any more forest ecoregions in the state. Well, that's partially true, but I kind of lied, because as we move further west from the Backland prairie, we get into what we call the cross timbers. And it's kind of goes back to a transitional zone between forest habitat and prairie ecoregions or prairie habitat. And so this is really, I guess you could say, the true last forest ecoregion in the state, but it's not really an intact forest because it's called the cross timbers, because when the first settlers came over here, it's a mixture of prairie and forest habitat. So you'll have a strip of timberland, and then you'll go into a strip of prairie, and then you'll go back into a strip of timberland. This ecoregion is marked by a lot of different soil types and geography, but it wasn't very suitable for a lot of farming. So most of it was left as ranching. So ranching dominated, is a dominant industry on the landscape here. Rainfall starts becoming limited in this ecoregion. And like I said, it's made up of open prairies and then some oak forests. Then when you get closer to the central part of the state, we get some of them juniper oak woodlands that are typical of the central part of the state. When you're looking at the map of the cross timbers, we're going to be east of Wichita Falls and Abilene and San Angelo. And then we're going to be kind of west of Fort Worth and Waco, but Fort Worth is included in the cross timbers. So I know when you're driving between Dallas and Fort Worth, it looks like it's just it is all just one city, but it doesn't really look like you're going to different ecoregions. But Dallas and Fort Worth are actually located in two separate ecoregions entirely. And when we divide out the cross timbers into some of these sub-ecoregions, you have a western ecoregion here in 29C, or western cross timbers, I mean, and then you have an eastern cross timbers, which is a small sliver here in the far east of Fort Worth. And in the middle, you'll have the Grand Prairie ecoregion of the cross timbers. And so some of these names are probably actually sounding familiar to y'all that are familiar with Fort Worth. You'll hear about the Grand Prairie a lot up there, and this is where that name comes from, is there was historically a large prairie between the western cross timbers and the eastern cross timbers, and Fort Worth would have been included in that Grand Prairie. When you get down to the southern area of the cross timbers, it's kind of a transitional zone between that oak juniper woodland that we see more typical of this in the central part of the state. And then this 29F here, that is a unique little subsection in here, and that's what we like to call the Palo Pinto Mountains or Possum Kingdom area. If any of y'all are familiar with that part of the state, it's really rocky. It has a lot of juniper woodlands. It's a little bit different than the rest of the cross timbers. And then the last thing I want to point out on this cross timbers map, and I already mentioned it, was this sliver of the eastern cross timbers. It's only about 10 to 15 miles wide at its widest point. And you can see it goes just north of Waco to east of Fort Worth and Denton, and then up to the Red River Valley. Depending on your source, some people consider this one of the most endangered forest ecoregions, not only in Texas, but also in North America, because it's just this small little sliver. And I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with this area. Most of this has been converted into suburbs or been grown into the DFW or Waco area. So this is there's not much of the eastern cross timbers left. And it is unique from the western cross timbers, as the eastern cross timbers sees a little bit more hardwoods because it has just a little bit more rainfall. So here's I guess you could say, stereotypical picture of the cross timbers. On the left would be your more of a prairie type habitat, and then on the right, and this is a picture of the Palo Pinto Mountains, would be more of your oak woodlands. As far as animals in this part of the state, there's really nothing too unique. So I just kind of put what I call typical Texas wildlife, which can be found pretty abundantly in this part of the state: turkey and deer. There's a lot of deer, and that's kind of what this ecoregion is known for, is having a lot of deer and turkey. It also gets far enough west that we start seeing more of them common arid animals that we see in the western part of the state, such as jackrabbits, start to become kind of a common sight in this part of this ecoregion. So now we're going to move into, we're starting to get into a lot of our plains ecoregions. First one's going to be what we call the Central Great Plains, which extends not only in Texas, but up through Oklahoma and Kansas. But in Texas, we like to call it the Rolling Plains. I don't know if that's just a Texas thing, but as you see in this presentation, a lot of these ecoregions we have our own nicknames for. I guess that's just a Texas thing to call it something different than everybody else, but we call this the Rolling Plains. And when you think of the Central Great Plains or the Rolling Plains, this is what, when you think of them old images of people going across the plains out west in their wagons, or the Native Americans riding after buffalo, this is where a lot of that would have occurred, especially in Texas, but also in Kansas and Nebraska and the other plain states. It's a level plains, and it's kind of gets into more of a mid-grass type plain. So we don't see grasses reaching 30, 40 inches in height, more around that 20-inch mark in a good year. But it has a lot of red clay and sand, but it actually is fairly suited for farming and ranching. So a lot of it has been converted to farming. We have a lot of large ranches in this state, and overgrazing has become a big deal, to where most of our native grasses have been grazed out and been replaced by a lot of woody vegetation, mostly mesquite and then prickly pear. So really this ecoregion, when you drive through it, really looks like a grassland anymore. It's really been converted to a shrubland. And so with that, we really have a loss of all our endemic prairie type species. Again, prairie, bison, prairie chicken, stuff like that. It is still one of the epicenters for bobwhite quail left in the state. We see some of our most stable populations of bobwhite quail in the Central Great Plains. So here's a map of it. We're east of the Panhandle, but we're west of that kind of that DFW area. Wichita Falls, Abilene, San Angelo, that'd be your major towns included in this. They kind of divide this out, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but they have the red prairie, the broken red plains, and then the limestone plains. The only difference is this broken red plains is more suitable for farming than when you get down in the limestone plains. So you see more ranching down here around San Angelo and Abilene compared to up around Wichita Falls, where you see a lot more farming. Here's some pictures of what it looks like driving through the Central Great Plains of the state. This picture on the left, you would say, well, that looks like it still looks like a good prairie habitat or prairie ecoregion. Well, it is a grassland, but that's all been improved grasses or some kind of inverted grasses that have come in there over time as we've overgrazed. That's not going to be the native grasses that we used to see in this part of the state. And then just like on this picture here, on both of these pictures, you can see in the background how the shrubland is really encroached in this part of the state. And that's going to be mainly made up of mesquite, and really has converted a lot of part of this state into shrubland. The bottom right is a picture of I think the Salt Fork of the Brazos River. So in this part of the state is where we start seeing a lot of our tributaries of our major rivers start to come into play. And we see and rivers start to play a very important role in wildlife and then in natural resources for this part of the state, because we're starting to get pretty arid, so water becomes a big deal. As far as wildlife and plants go, you don't really see anything too unique because we've lost a lot of our endemic prairie species, but you start seeing some species that are more, I guess you could say, representative of the western parts of the state. Burrowing out here on the top left. We do have some prairie dog towns left in this part of the state. This is a true story here. For my job, our county has some lease land up in Throckmorton County, which is included in this ecoregion. And I was visiting with one of the landowners up there last year, and he was talking about growing up how there used to be so many prairie dogs in Throckmorton County, and now you don't see any. And he was just wondering what happened to all of them. And he said there used to be a nuisance. Now there's not any of them. And one of the deals was, and I kind of told this to him, not only did we kind of kill a lot of them out, but prairie dogs need grassland. They're a grassland species. And now all that land up in Throckmorton County is shrubland. So, there's not the habitat for them anymore. And that was just kind of unique that, here's a guy in his generation went from seeing a species that used to be abundant where he grew up at to now he hadn't seen them in decades. Texas horned toad or horned lizard becomes pretty common in this part of the state. Like I said, bobwhite quail, kind of an epicenter for them. And then this is just a picture of side oats grama, which for y'all that don't know, that's our Texas state grass. And it's a mid grass, and it's one of the dominant grass species in this part of the state. The next ecoregion is going to be Southwest Tablelands. We also in Texas just call this part of the rolling plains. This is a very rugged landscape. If any of y'all ever heard of the Cap Rock Escarpment or Pallador Canyon, this would be included in the Southwestern Tablelands. These tablelands aren't just unique to Texas. They extend into parts of New Mexico and Oklahoma and southeast Colorado also. But like I said, it's a very rugged landscape with a lot of variety of soils. We're getting very arid. It's kind of a dividing line between a lot of the species that are kind of more adapted to the southeast and the eastern part of the continent, compared to when you get to the next ecoregion, which is going to be the high plains, is stuff that you see in Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, stuff like that. A good example of this divide would be this ecoregion is kind of the divide between white-tailed deer, which is the deer species that we see in the eastern half of North America, compared to mule deer, which is this deer species we see in the western half of North America. Because the soil is poor and it's arid, minimal farming, grama buffalo grass made up a lot the grassland parts of this ecoregion, while in some of the rugged more landscape where you had a lot more rock geography, it would have been a juniper, shrub oak, savanna. Like I said, the Cap Rock escarpments found in this ecoregion, and then the Canadian River in the northern part of the Panhandle. And the Canadian River is important for several reasons. I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. When we're looking at the map of the Southwestern Tablelands, you can see it pretty much makes up that eastern half of the Panhandle, north of San Angelo, west of Abilene, but east of Amarillo and Lubbock. So we'll just start up here in the top. This little strip here in the top, this would be our Canadian breaks. This is created by the Canadian River, which flows right down the middle of it. And it's kind of a broader breaks compared to down here along the Cap Rock Escarpment. So you see a little bit, the breaks and the mesas and the plateaus are a little bit spread apart a little bit deeper, spread apart a little bit more up in the northern part of the Panhandle, compared to the Cap Rock Escarpment, which runs south of Amarillo down east of Lubbock to east of Midland, Odessa, which is if y'all have ever traveled in this part of the state, when you're traveling east from Lubbock or Amarillo, it's basically, like they say, flat as a pancake, and then all of a sudden the earth just drops out and it drops 1,000 or 2,000 feet. I mean, it's a very rugged landscape, and it's a very defining drop off, and you'll see that in pictures on the next slide. And then intermixed to mix some of the more rugged breaks or some broader valleys and flat tablelands that do support some farming. Here's some pictures of typical the Cap Rock escarpment and these table breaks. The top left is Pallador Canyon, which is actually the second largest canyon in the United States. A lot of people don't know that. It's second behind the Grand Canyon. So that's Pallador Canyon and Pallador Canyon State Park. This picture here on the bottom left and this picture here on the right is Cap Rock Canyon State Park. And I took these pictures personally. And the reason why I wanted to include these two pictures is, so I was on an aoudad hunt in Cap Rock Canyon State Park, and we were sitting up here on this ridge, and we wanted to go over here to this ridge because we wanted to glaze over there to see if we could see any aoudad. So our objective was to walk across kind of this flat spot. We thought that we were going to be able to do that, but we were wrong because, and this is kind of a closer up when we got down into this flatter area, but you really can't see it in too much detail here on this picture. But it's such a rugged landscape. There was probably no less, I would assume, 20 or 30 draws between this plateau here and this one. And each one of these draws probably dropped off 20, 30 feet through here. And we were unable to walk across here after about an hour or so of trying. So we just gave up walking over there and just decided to stay over here. But that's just kind of to, I guess, interpret how rugged this landscape really is. It's gorgeous, but it's rugged. And then this picture on the bottom, it's not the best of picture. That's going to be the Canadian River. And the Canadian River is important from a ecological standpoint, not only because it's one of the few areas that hold water in this part of the state, but it's a very broad, flat river, and it's very shallow. And because of that, it creates a lot of sandbars. So that creates habitat for some unique animals that rely on these sandbars for nesting. And we'll go right into that. And that would be this interior tern, which is pictured here on the top left. It needs these sandbars to nest in, and it's actually a protected species because a lot of these, sandbars are disappearing because as we use water out of the river for towns and irrigation purposes and whatnot, we're getting less sandbars because now it's no longer a sandbar, it's just connected straight to the land. And so obviously once your sandbar doesn't have water around it, then these terns, which nest directly on the ground with no kind of protection, their eggs are able to get predated on by coyotes, raccoons, or whatnot. The other species that is important for the Canadian River is this fish on the far right. You know, that just looks like a plain Jane minnow. That's actually the Arkansas silvery minnow, and it relies on the Canadian River and other rivers in the Arkansas River watershed for reproduction purposes, because it needs, the way this guy reproduces is it lays an egg, and I don't know off the top of my head, but that egg has to stay within the water column for a day or two before it hatches. If that egg settles out on the bottom substrate, that egg is then going to die and never hatch. So what that means is you need maybe 100 miles of water that's moving fast enough so that egg doesn't drop out of the water column. But it also means that you can't have any kind of reservoir and impoundment. Well, as y'all probably know, we impound a lot of rivers because we need the water and for flood control purposes. So historically, this Arkansas silvery minnow would have been found all up and down the Arkansas River watershed, all the way from Arkansas, Oklahoma, and probably even in parts of Kansas. Well, most of them larger river bodies now have too many impoundments along them to where there's not a large enough stretch of moving water to keep the eggs from falling out. So one of the few places you still find that is the Canadian River and the Panhandle, because there's only about one impoundment up there, Lake Meredith. So we have about, what might need 75, 100 miles of open river for their eggs to survive before they hatch. And so that's why the Canadian River is important. If you remember, I mentioned grama grass kind of makes up a lot of the herbaceous growth in this ecoregion. It's just a picture of grama grass. This is actually a picture of I can't ever remember if we call them bison or buffalo. I'm sure somebody on this presentation listening to it probably will correct me, but I can't remember if we have buffalo or bison. I think we have buffalo is technically what we're supposed to call them. But either way, or maybe it's bison. But either way, this is a picture of a bison that I took at Cat Rock Canyon State Park when I was up there hunting. Because for y'all that don't know, we actually have kind of our own little Yellowstone in Texas now, where Parks and Wildlife has actually released some of the state herd buffalo into the park, and they're kind of almost free ranging. They have range in most of the parks, so it's kind of neat that we're kind of returning these animals back to some of their original, where they were originally found. And it's actually an interesting story about these guys. So these individuals in the park are part of what they call the Goodnight herd, or the Southern bison herd. And so we originally think that the southern bison were a little bit different than the northern bison that you would see up like in the Dakotas and southern parts of Canada and Wyoming and Montana. And the southern bison herd got hammered a lot harder than the north. Well, they all got hammered hard through when we came out into the plains, but we pretty much killed out all the southern bison herd. And Goodnight, and it was either him himself or some of his descendants. Y'all probably recognize that name. He was one of the first big ranchers in the state, and we even had a cattle drive named after him. They recognized in their lifetime, this would have been like in, I guess, in the late 1800s, that if they didn't do anything to protect the southern bison herd, it was just going to disappear because they were just seeing them all disappear rapidly. So they actually went and took some of these individuals on their own property that they had and pinned them up and saved them from being hunted or just lost. And then over time, I believe the story goes, and I might not have this 100% correct, that eventually they donated that herd to Parks and Wildlife, kind of like as a donation to the state. And now the Parks and Wildlife manages it. Now it's been the southern bison herd has basically been released back out into the Caprock Canyon State Park to some of the original areas it would have been found at. I do know that if you read some of the literature, they'll say that if Goodnight and his descendants didn't save some of these individuals, there would not be any representatives left from the southern bison herd, because all the bison that you see up in like Yellowstone and Wyoming and Montana and all that on some of the larger tracts of land up there, that would have been from the northern bison herd. And here's a top right is mule deer. Like I said, this is where mule deer start to come into play. So white-tailed deer start to drop out, mule deer start to come into play. For y'all that don't know, mule deer, we call them mule deer because I would assume the first pioneers came across, and you can see they got big ears, so they kind of look like the ears on a mule. From a biological standpoint, the reason why they got big ears is they're living in hot, arid climates, and if you get a bigger ear, you get more blood vessels up into it, so your blood can contact more air and cool down better. So they have more blood flow, get more contact with the air, and they can stay cooler in these hotter environments. Another interesting thing about mule deer and white-tailed deer, and this is something that's actively going on in the state right now, is as you can probably see from this presentation, as we utilize the land for our own purposes, we tend to overutilize it, and when it goes from a grassland to a brushland. So in this part of the state, where a lot of our grasslands have been converted to shrublands or brushlands, the white-tailed deer find that more adapted. So a mule deer is more adaptive for open type habitats. You can think of a grassland with maybe a little draw with a few trees down in it that it can go hide in if it needs to, but it's going to be found in more open habitats. Compared that to white-tailed deer, which thrive in a mixture of shrubland and open areas. So that's why we have such a large population of white-tailed deer in Texas, because y'all know we have plenty of mesquite shrub and oak juniper woodlands and stuff like that. So what's happening up here in the Southwest Tablelands and the Panhandle is white-tailed deer are actually slowly out-competing basically the mule deer, because they're more adapted now to the habitat that you're seeing in this part of the state. And it's kind of funny because myself as a hunter included, we know in southern parts of Texas and central, in 2/3 of the state, people want large white-tailed deer on their property because that's what hunters pay to go hunt, and it's a good revenue source for the landowners. In this part of the state, there's a lot of landowners that don't want to see the white-tailed deer because they're out competing the mule deer, and the mule deer is what's drawing the revenue source for them. So there's some interesting dynamics going on between the mule deer and the white-tailed deer up in this part of the state. Okay, so as we move up above the Caprock Escarpment, we get to what we call the high plains, or again, what we call in Texas and New Mexico, the llano estacado, which is stacked plain. And that's a pretty good definition for it. It would have been a short grass prairie, so we're talking grasses that don't get no taller than 6 or 8 inches. It would have been very arid It's very arid, it's very level. Soil erosion is a huge deal in this part of the state. For y'all historical textbook people, you'll probably know that this is where the Dust Bowl had its origins at. We get a lot of wind here, so we get a lot of wind erosion. Even though it's very dry, the soil is pretty good on farming if you can irrigate it. So farming is the dominant industry, along with oil and gas is huge in this part of the state. Again, it would have been historically, the grassland would have been a Grama buffalo grass would have been your dominant two grass species. The Okologgo, I can't ever pronounce it, but the Okologgo aquifer is a major aquifer in this part of the state. And it goes up into Colorado and New Mexico and western parts of Oklahoma and Kansas and Wyoming. But this ecoregion is entirely dependent on the water out of the aquifer for farming and for their cities. So we're actually utilizing it at a higher rate than it's getting refilled because there's not much rainfall in this part of the state. So there's a big push by not only water managers, but farmers are taking a big role in trying to figure out how to solve this issue through better irrigation practices, better crop management, so that we can ensure that there'll always be water to support the farming industry and the towns in this part of the state. I'm going to talk about playa lakes in detail here in a minute. Just know that playa lakes are a shallow depression that you see that hold water when it does actually rain, and it's important for wildlife, and we're going to show some pictures of that. There is some remnant prairie tracts that you'll see in certain areas, and they still hold some of them, I guess you could say, typical Great Plains species. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. So when we look at the llano estacado, basically the western part of the panhandle, the true flat plain llano estacado stacked plain would have been like between Amarillo, Lubbock down to Midland. Most of this has been converted into farmland. What you'll see though is in this 25J, which they call these shinery sands, and then up here in the northern part of the panhandle, which they're calling the Canadian high plains, and then this 25B, which is these rolling sand plains. The soils here are a little bit more sandy, and even down here around west of Odessa, you actually get sand hills. If you ever heard of the Monahan sand hills, this is where these guys are, where they're actually unstabilized sand dunes. So either way, obviously you're not going to be able to farm in very sandy soil. So most of this was left as ranch land. So this is where we still see some of what the high plains used to look like before we converted it all into farmland, is in these shinery sands. Also to note, this is also where we see a lot of the oil and gas production going on. And that has a huge impact. Like down here around Midland, Odessa, this is obviously part of the Permian Basin, which is a huge oil and gas industry for the state. And that has important interest because there's some endangered species that are in conflict with the oil and gas. So it creates a conflict. So it's kind of ironic that some of the last, or at least I think it is, some of the last areas where you'll still see some of these high plains species, because we couldn't farm it, is now being in conflict again with human uses, because this is where we're seeing oil and gas production. So we'll talk about playa lakes here on the top left. This is a typical aerial view of what it would look like between Lubbock and Amarillo. You can see it's flat with farmland, but you have all these shallow depressions which hold water, so you can't really farm it when it rains. But this is hugely important for migrating waterfowl. All our waterfowl in the central part of North America migrate and historically would have utilized these playa lakes. Top right, this is a picture of the shinery sandhills. So this is where you still see some of the grasslands and some of the grassland species that we would have seen in the high plains. Bottom left, this is before we converted to farming, which it looks like now in most parts of the panhandle. This is what it would have historically looked like. Short grass prairie made up of grama grass and buffalo grass. Bottom right, and the reason why I threw this in here, this is the part of the state where I feel sorry for these people, really, because they just have huge weather extremes up here, and this obviously affects the plants and animals. We see large blizzards, like in this picture. I think this blizzard was in, I can't remember, the 30s, I think, or maybe it was the 40s. But you also see heat waves, droughts, dust bowls, tornadoes, just the weather extremes in the high plains or something else. So this is kind of pictures of some of the species that I say you kind of think of when you think of the Great Plains. We'll start off at the top left. Sandhill cranes and other geese and waterfowl utilize the Pile Lakes and the Panhandle. Bottom left in the shinery sand, you still see some greater prairie chickens, or lesser prairie chickens, different species. Not so much in Texas, but historically you would have seen obviously herds of thousands, if not tens of thousands of bison roaming the plains. We still do have a lot of pronghorn antelope in the high plains. It's mostly centered around north of the Canadian River and that far northern reaches of the Panhandle, but the population is very stable in the Panhandle where pronghorn are still at. And even though we call them antelope, just FYI, they're not actually related to antelope. They're totally on their own branch of the tree there. But the pronghorn population is very stable here, and the Parks and Wildlife actually transplants pronghorn from this part of the state to other parts of the state where populations aren't as good. And I think this picture is very, very neat and important because it shows how even though the species pronghorn are doing well in this part of the state, when we manage right for both human uses and wildlife, we can manage for both and be successful. As you can see, we have large-scale commercial irrigation going on for farmland in the background, and then right in the foreground is a stable pronghorn antelope herd. So now we're going to move out into the Trans-Pecos, or the Chihuahua Desert. This is basically, you can kind of consider it everything west of the Pecos River. This is that area that sticks out in West Texas when you're looking at this map of the state. The Chihuahua Desert is one of 4 deserts that you can find in North America. The others are the Mojave, the Sonora, and the sagebrush, or the steep, or in Utah. So how you know if this is just kind of interesting tidbit here. If you know you're in the Chihuahua Desert, because the Chihuahua Desert is marked by creosote bush, you see a lot of creosote bush. You know you're in the Mojave Desert because you basically have nothing, because that's like Death Valley there in California. You know, it's so arid that nothing hardly grows. You know you're in the Sonora Desert because that's where we see the Sonora cactus, you know, the typical kind of Southwest America scene. And then the sagebrush desert that you see like in parts of Utah and Nevada is made up of sagebrush. So we have the Chihuahua Desert, which we have a lot of creosote bush, and we'll show a picture of that here in a minute. But the geography out here, I mean, if you're a geologist, you love this part of the state because there's so much going on from a geological standpoint. You have salt basins, you have mountain ranges created by ancient volcanoes, you have erosion, you have limestone erosion. There's a lot going on from a geological standpoint. Farming's limited to just where we have a few springs that they use for irrigation purposes. We do actually, though, when you get out around El Paso, you know, everybody likes pecans in Texas. We think of pecan production being so common when you like around, you know, east of Austin, kind of in that central part of the state. But really, most of our large-scale commercial pecan production occurs out in El Paso, because with pecans, we have pecans get hit hard by all kind of fungal diseases. So they do great out in the arid desert, and there's some irrigation that we get out of the springs in the Rio Grande River out there. So if you ever go out to El Paso, you know what I'm talking about. There's pecan orchards everywhere out there. Oil and gas is big in this part of the state. What's neat about the Trans-Pecos is we see a lot of Western and Mexico subspecies that you don't see anywhere else in Texas. you see these animals and plants out here are more related to what you might see in Colorado, New Mexico, or northern parts of Mexico. We have what we call these sky islands, which is basically means you have your desert floor, which is typical desert, but then you have mountain ranges that get just high enough to get enough rainfall, and the temperatures are a little bit cooler, that they support forest and plants and animals that you would more associate with like the Rocky Mountains, the higher elevations of the Rocky Mountains. Like I mentioned already, we have a lot of unique desert springs out here that support protected or rare fish species. Thing about desert springs is they're usually so far from the next one that you'll have one pup fish or darter fish that's known just from one spring system, because the next spring system is 100 miles away and there's no water between the two, so there's no way for them to get between each one. So you have a lot of fish species that are associated with just one desert spring systems out here in the Trans-Pecos. And because we have so much different geology and elevation and rainfall, we have a variety of vegetation. So this map's very, very, very busy, but basically the Chihuahua Desert of Trans-Pecos is roughly everything west of the Pecos River, which is the line I just drew. Some of it does go east of the Pecos, but just everything west of the Pecos roughly. I'm not going to go through all the little sub-ecoregions, but basically if you look at the list, when you start out at the lower elevations, you have basin and playas. So basically you have your desert floor. You get maybe go up about 1,000 feet, you get a little bit more rainfall, so you get some desert grasslands. You get around, maybe 5,000-6,000 feet, you get low mountains that start maybe getting some brush or shrub in there. And then when you get in some of our higher mountain ranges that are pushing around, 7,000-8,000 feet or so, I think, off the top of my head. Then you get what we call montane woodland. So basically you're getting pine forest, and you would see that in the Davis Mountains, Chias Mountains, and the Big Bend, and some of these other smaller mountain ranges, or some of these other isolated mountain ranges. The only thing that's off from this is the Stockton Plateau, which is this 24E. And that's basically, it's a limestone plateau that's different than the rest of the Trans-Pecos. Best way to think of this, if you ever been around Fort Stockton or drove west on I-10, basically looks like the hill country, except that there's no oak trees because it gets too dry. So it's mostly just mesquite or juniper or cedar. So we're going to follow that kind of that same trend from low elevation to high elevation. Starting here on the top left, this would be your desert floor, your basin and playas, kind of flat, not much going on. All this vegetation that you see here is all creosote bush. So historically, this would have been more of a really kind of scattered grassland with maybe a little bit of creosote bush scattered throughout. But what happened is we came in here and we overgrazed this really heavily because we thought we could graze at the same rate that we saw maybe like in the central or eastern parts of the state. And once the grass, the ecological factors here don't allow for the grasses to be really resilient to overgrazing like you would see in a higher rainfall area. So pretty much once you overgraze this once, it's done with, because it's really hard for it to recover. So nature doesn't like a vacuum. So then the creosote bush came in and becomes the dominant species. And creosote bush releases a toxic chemical compound in its root system that doesn't allow for anything else to grow. So that's why once creosote bush becomes established out here in the Chihuahua Desert, that's pretty much all you got on your landscape, as you can see in this picture. And what's bad about it is, a lot of times we like to use fire to get rid of brush species. Well, for one thing, you can't hardly get enough vegetation to grow out here to support a fire because it's so dry. And two, once the creosote bush becomes established, because it's releasing a chemical compound that's not allowing anything else to grow, you can't even get any vegetation to grow to support a fire. So you just end up with creosote bush. So either way, as you move a little bit higher in vegetation, you get some of the high desert grasslands that you see in this top right. This would be a picture of the Marfa Plateau or the Marfa grasslands. And you can see we get a little shrub land, but you can see we have significant grassland growth. the grass stays dormant or dead for most of the year. They actually have a monsoon season out here in the Trans-Pecos. So for most part of the state, you kind of think of as our rainfall being kind of, most of our rainfall kind of comes in that spring, winter time, and then it kind of drops off in the summertime when we get dry, and then maybe you have, it starts peaking back up in the later part of fall. Out here in West Texas, they actually, like I say, have a monsoon season where they get most of their rain, I believe, comes like in around July, August, September, somewhere in there, where they might only get 3 or 4 large thunderstorms in August, and that's it. So they'll be dry for 10 months out of the year, and then they'll get a monsoon rain, and then everything comes alive and they get all their growth in maybe a 30-day period. And then as we get a little bit higher in elevation, you see some of these low mountains that still aren't high enough to support a lot of vegetation. So it's more just rocky mountains, or mountains that are very rugged and rugged. And this is a good picture to show how a lot of these mountain ranges were created by volcanoes. If any of y'all know anything about geology, you'll recognize that this is this, I guess you could say, stacked rock is representative of lava flows from ancient volcanoes from when the lava cooled. And then this middle picture, this would be our Sky Islands. This is actually a picture of, this is Mount Livermore in the background. And this is when I hiked up to the top of it. So we were in this is the highest, Mount Livermore is the highest peak in the Davis Mountains, which the Davis Mountains is the second highest mountain range in Texas, just for y'all's information. But this would be your montane woodlands, where you almost see, this looks like almost like a Rocky Mountain landscape with pine trees in it. Ponderosa pine, pinon pine, southwestern white pine are kind of your common tree species. And then bottom right, I wanted to include this. A lot of these areas are internally drained. So when it rains, it just rains to one spot, but it doesn't really flow into a watershed or a river. So when the water evaporates, you end up with the salt flats. So we have some considerably large salt flats out here in this part of the state. Like I said, your vegetation is very vast because of such different geology and elevation. But either way, your typical, when you get up into some of the higher elevations, this would, on the left, this would be a picture of ponderosa pine. So you can see considerably tall pine tree. This is one of my favorite trees. This is alligator juniper, and you can get why they call it alligator juniper. It's very, you can see its bark gets this, it looks like the back of an alligator hide. So that's why I call it alligator juniper. And then the picture on the far right, some of y'all as master naturalists will probably recognize this as Texas madrone. I think this is probably I think this is my favorite tree in the state. It's a gorgeous tree. If you ever had a chance to see it, you'll know what I'm talking about. It loses its bark, so it gets white, but then it has like the streaks of peach color in it. And then when some of its branches actually die, the branch just kind of stays on it and turns this real dark black charcoal color. So it's a real interesting difference of color on one tree. And these aren't, Texas madrone isn't just limited to the Trans-Pecos. You will find it in the hill country and central parts of the state. But I think they seem to get bigger out there. Just like with our plants, our animals are very diverse. We do have some pronghorn in the grasslands. These are canyon towhees, I believe. So this would be, you start seeing bird species that you see more out in the inner-mountains. This is a picture of one of our, I can't remember what fish now, but I think it's one of our darters. This is Biomes springs that are associated with the desert springs we see out here. We restock bighorn sheep out in the Trans-Pecos. They are a different subspecies than the one that was historically found out in West Texas, but that subspecies is now extinct, so we have to bring in a different subspecies. But that's a pretty in-depth conversation for another day that actually riles up a lot of people. So there's some issues with that, but we'll leave that for another presentation. Black bear actually repopulated the Big Bend area in the Davis Mountains all on their own, which is actually unique because it's one of the few examples of a large predator repopulating an area on its own. through its own migration. Nowadays, because usually suitable habitats so far apart, if we want to repopulate a large predator to a new habitat, it usually requires us to actually go in there and manually transport them. Black bears did this on their own from mountain ranges in northern Mexico. So that's kind of a unique story. A picture of a Western scrub jay, I believe. And so it's just a picture of species that you start seeing out further west. It's actually eating a cracker I fed it, so it was being very photogenic. So our next ecoregion is what we call the Arizona, New Mexico mountains. It's different from the Trans-Pecos because of how it was created geologically. So if geologists consider the way these mountains were created similar to how the Rocky Mountains were created compared to the rest of the mountain ranges that we talked about in the Trans-Pecos. So our Arizona, New Mexico mountains in Texas is this little area out here, and this is the Guadalupe Mountains, which it's all within the Guadalupe Mountains National Park. And I like to tell people, if you ever like to brag on Texas, you can say that we actually have Rocky Mountains in Texas, because from a geological standpoint, the Guadalupe Mountains are associated with the Rocky Mountains. So that's just something, if you're looking for bragging points for Texas. Because of that reason, there's a lot of species that are found only in the Guadalupe Mountains that are found nowhere else in Texas, because they're only found in New Mexico or Colorado. McKidra Canyon, if y'all ever get a chance to visit the Guadalupe Mountains, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. It looks like something you would see in Colorado. When you divide out the Guadalupe Mountains, you just have your desert slopes and then your higher elevations. So here's some pictures of what you would expect in the Guadalupe Mountains. So from the plant and animal standpoint, again, this is actually a picture. You'll see the tree in the middle is a picture of a Douglas fir, a very tall one. You'll see them in other mountain ranges in West Texas, but they're most common in the Guadalupe Mountains. The picture on the bottom left is a picture of our only native chipmunk that's found in Texas. It's only found in the Guadalupe Mountains. We do have herds of elk roaming in the Guadalupe Mountains, free-ranging herds of elk. It's kind of the same story as the bighorn sheep. Our native subspecies of elk was wiped out through extinction, through overhunting and diseases, but we brought back a different subspecies basically, but it's still elk is elk. Picture on the bottom right is McKidra Canyon that I was talking about. And as you can see, that's it in the fall with the maple trees turning colors. It's a beautiful place. I highly recommend if you ever get a chance to go visit. So in the McKidra Canyon is the only place in Texas that trout naturally reproduce on their own. So not to go in too much detail, because like I said, I get long-winded and I've been talking long enough. Historically, we believe we had what's in this top left picture, which is a picture of Rio Grande cutthroat trout, were native to McKidra Canyon. Them trout were wiped out for a variety of reasons. But at one point, one of the original owners of this land restocked it with rainbow trout. And the rainbow trout actually survived on their own and are actually reproducing in McKidra Canyon on their own. Now, give it, they're very stunted because the habitat's not the greatest and they're barely making it, but they do make it on their own. And there's actually some work being done by some fisheries biologists, maybe promoting restocking Rio Grande cutthroat trout, maybe not only back into McKidra Canyon and the Guadalupe Mountains, but maybe into some of these other mountain streams we see in the Davis Mountains and some of these other mountain ranges in West Texas to maybe bring back a native fish species. It's kind of a highly debated topic because there's a lot that goes on with that. Do we, for one thing, the rainbow trout in McKidra Canyon are now basically part of our natural heritage of Texas, so we really don't want to take them out of there. But if you're going to bring back a species such as Rio Grande cutthroat trout, you don't want them competing with rainbow trout that weren't originally native at all. The other kind of debate in that is, so in the Davis Mountains and the Guadalupe Mountains and some of these other mountain ranges, the habitat matches what is required of Rio Grande cutthroat trout. So we believe they were probably historically there because you find them in the same habitat right over the border in New Mexico. But we don't have any good scientific evidence of that. I believe the only evidence of that, of us having on record of Rio Grande cutthroat trout actually being found in Texas was I believe a very rough drawing from an early biologist when he was traveling through this part of the state in the 1800s, and then maybe some writings from some of the first pioneers out there. But we don't have any actual sample. We don't have any recorded sample in a university or in a lab anywhere of anybody that ever actually collected Rio Grande cutthroat trout from in Texas. So it's kind of one of those things. We're pretty sure they probably were found here, but we can't 100% say they were. So now that was our whole east to west transect across the state, going from high rainfall to low rainfall, from piney woods to tallgrass prairie to desert. We now have 3 more ecoregions to cover, and these kind of but the trend, I guess you can say. I mean, their plants are based off of the rainfall they get, but they don't really kind of go along that good transit that we've seen in the other ecoregions. The first of them is probably a lot of people's favorite ecoregion in Texas, and that's going to be the Edwards Plateau, or what we like to call the hill country. You know, this is kind of where we like to go float the river and go to Fredericksburg and all that good stuff. But either way, this is what we call a dissected limestone plateau. So it's actually, we call it a plateau because it was an uplift that came, geologically, the limestone was uplifted. But for y'all that probably know this, limestone is very easily eroded. It erodes very easily. So over time, the water erosion has allowed for these deep canyons and gorges and cuts to be cut through the hill country. And then we also see, when you see limestone that's being eroded, you get what we call this karst geography, which creates a labyrinth of caves and sinkholes and aquifers. So we have the Edwards Plateau aquifer here, and so that's important for the state from a resource standpoint. So some other highlights of the hill country, because it's shallow soil, is very rocky. It's always been a very important ranching area of the state. But, in the last, I guess you could say 20, 30 years, everybody wants to own their piece of Texas and their little ranchette. And a lot of people, the hill country is very beautiful and it has a lot going for it. So this is a part of the state that's seen a lot of urbanization from land fragmentation, selling large ranches off of the smaller ones, but also from urban sprawl from San Antonio and Austin and San Marcos and New Braunfels. Historically, we believe it was more of a juniper oak savanna. So on the hilltops and the rolling hills would have been more of a grassland. And then you would have just seen juniper and oak trees in some of the more rugged landscape where fire couldn't really get too easily. And that's actually one reason why, if you read talk to some of the old accounts of the settlers coming over here from Germany and Austria, the reason why they settled around Fredericksburg in this part of the state was it reminded them a lot of the Alps that they saw, the rolling fields of the Alps that they were used to back home in Europe. Because this ecoregion, the hill country, is kind of separate from other, I guess you could say, oak woodlands and kind of more of a mountain type habitat. And then because we have the aquifers and the springs, we get these riparian areas that aren't really connected to other clear, I guess you could say, cool, clear mountain running streams. So that leads to a lot of what Texas endemics that are found nowhere else outside of Texas, and that are only found in the hill country. And that would include both plant and animal species. And we're going to show that pictures of that here in a minute. So obviously, I think most people know where the hill country is, that big area in the central part of the state. But most of the people associate the hill country with this area, this darker green area here called the Biomes Canyon lands. That's just because that's where a lot of the tourist attractions are. So, Kerrville, Fredericksburg, western side of Austin, San Antonio, Bandera, Comal River, Garner, all that good stuff. But the Edwards Plateau actually extends as far west as almost wraps around San Angelo, getting pretty close to Midland, and then about out to the Pecos River. So the difference, what you see in the differences is when you get in the Biomes Canyon lands, it's more rugged compared to further west out here in the plateau woodlands. And then the further west you get, the more arid you get. So it gets to be more of a grassland compared to your oak trees start dropping out. Some people, this 34B is called the llano uplift. Depending on your source, some people actually conclude this to be a different ecological region in Texas because it's not made up of limestone. It's actually a granite uplift. And this is where you see Enchanted Rock and some of them giant granite rocks that you see in this part of the state. So it just depends on your source. As far as plants and animals, there's not much difference between what you see in the llano uplift and the rest of the Edwards Plateau. It's just if you're dividing the state out from a geological standpoint, you would say the llano uplift is obviously different than the limestone plateau that you see in the hill country. Okay, so here's some typical pictures of the hill country. Top left would be your Biomes Canyon land. Like I said, historically, this would have been probably a lot more grassland intermixed within here because fire was more common. Top right, here's a picture of a sinkhole. Sinkholes and caves are just found around about every corner in this part of the state, which allows for cave-dwelling animals and bats and other fish species in the waters that you find in these caves that are found nowhere else in the state. And then obviously the aquifers, the limestone allows water to seep into the aquifer, and then it comes up into the springs that create the Guadalupe River, the San Marcos River, the Comal, the Blanco, the Pedernales River, all the rivers we like to go float in Texas. And then bottom left is a picture of Enchanted Rock, which is representative of the granite you find in the llano uplift. So here's a picture of some of the species you can find here. We'll just start off far right. This is one of the Texas endemics, Guadalupe bass. You can't find Guadalupe bass anywhere outside of Texas, and they're mostly just found in the hill country or the Edwards Plateau. Sometimes you will find them in the Colorado River, a little bit outside of the Edwards Plateau. But for the most part, they're in the Edwards Plateau. Golden cheek wobbler is it was a protected species. I believe it still is. I think it might have gotten delisted a little bit. I can't remember now off the top of my head, but this is a bird species that nests in the juniper woodlands that we find in the hill country. This picture on the bottom, I don't remember the species name exactly, but it's a species of fishhook cactus that's found only in a couple locations around Junction in the central part of the hill country. And then also the further west you get in the hill country, it's just a picture of a pinon pine. And the reason why I included that in here is when you get far enough west, you start seeing some plant species that are more representative of the Trans-Pecos region. So I'm not an invertebrate person at all, but here's just a picture of, these are all Texas endemics that are found in cave systems or spring systems that you find in the Edwards Plateau. There is a long list of little beetles and spiders that you can't find outside of these caves. This on the far right is Texas rice, which is a wild species of rice found in the San Marcos River, I believe. And then we got some darters that are found in the spring systems. And then on the top right is the picture of we have these blind salamanders that are found, that live down in the aquifers, down in the aquifer, in the Edwards Plateau aquifer. And the only time we ever see them is when we have like a flood or for some reason one comes up through a spring. So we really don't know a lot about these guys. In fact, I think there's one species, I think it's the Blanco brown salamander, that's I think it's only been recorded from 1 or 2 specimens that have come up through the rocks over the years. So kind of, we have a lot of unique Texas endemics in this part of the state. And the aquifers are one of the, San Antonio relies on it 100% for its water, and so does Austin, and a lot of the other cities rely on it heavily for their drinking water. So there's a constant battle between maintaining the aquifer for water for humans and for the wildlife, and we don't want to drain it out too quickly because there's a lot of things depending on it. So our second to last ecoregion is South Texas Plains, or what we like to call the brush country. Is when we're getting down into South Texas, obviously. It's kind of a rolling plain. It's level in some spots. It can have some hilly spots to it. It's a variety of soils. It's very arid. This is where we've gotten getting down into the warm winters where we don't see freezes very often or very light freezes. This is a part of the state that has that long history of ranching heritage. Oil and gas is huge. Again, just like you'll see a trend, historically it was probably more of a grassland. Now it's more of a brush country, savanna, shrubland. You read some of the old accounts. We used to have pronghorn antelope and bison down in the southern parts of the state. I mean, I think one of the last pronghorn antelopes was trapped down around Kingsville sometime in the 1920s or 30s. I mean, we're not talking too long ago where this was really more of a plains grassland than brush country. Now we associate this as all being brush country down there. But either way, it's this thorn scrub or brush country, and it still holds a high and distinct diversity of plants and animals, and most of that's associated with stuff that reaches its northern limit coming out of Mexico into South Texas. So the brush country, basically south of San Antonio, all the way down to the Rio Grande River. Most of it's pretty much the same. The only thing to take note is the Rio Grande River makes a unique floodplain that hosts some different plant species and stuff like that. And then up here around San Antonio, if y'all ever heard of the Winter Garden area, this is what they're calling the Northern Oasis Plains. This is where we see a lot of our vegetable production in the state. So this is just kind of it's a good farming area. You will note that a lot of people can call the brush country down to South Texas will pretty much go all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. It's really not 100% correct because this would have been more of a coastal prairie down here. Over time, it's pretty much all been converted to thorn scrub or brush country. So there's really not much of a difference anymore. But for scientific purposes, there is a difference between the brush country you would see around between Brownsville and Kingsville and the brush country you'd see between Laredo and San Antonio. So here's pictures of typical South Texas brush countries, about what you could expect. Pretty much they like to say, I think everything either scratch, bites, or will sting you down in this part of the state. I mean, the thorn scrub is pretty much impenetrable. You would not want to walk through this. You would come out cut up like crazy and be bleeding all over the place. A lot of cactus, a lot of acacia type plants, mesquite type plants, and so on and so forth. But huge diversity of wildlife and plants down here. And this slide just kind of represents all these species that are endemic. They're not endemic to Texas because you're going to find them in northern Mexico, but you can't find them outside of South Texas. And because of that, this ecoregion has huge nature tourism because birders and people that are interested in wildlife will come down here just to see these species. So top left is Texas indigo snake. And these guys feed on rattlesnakes. You can see this guy's eating this pretty large rattlesnake here. So people actually like these snakes down there in this part of the state. Bottom left is a grooved-billed Annie, which is a kind of a neat looking bird. Middle picture is a picture of the Texas gopher tortoise. It's one of our only tortoise here in Texas. Bottom right is probably one of the most photographed birds down in the valley, and that's a green jay. Everybody likes to look at them. Pretty cool looking. And then here's just a picture of all the different types of yuccas and acacias and cactus type plants we see here. So the last ecoregion, and probably one of my favorite ecoregions, just because this is where I'm from, but this would be our coastal plains or our Western Gulf coastal plains. It extends into Louisiana, but the vast, about 80% of it's found here in Texas. It's basically a narrow strip of land that borders along the coast. More of a midgrass when you get down around Corpus and South Texas, up around Houston and close to Louisiana, been more of a tall grass prairie. Deep soils, so it was great for farming, and it was flat, and it rains here all the time, so you don't need irrigation for the most part, unless you're doing rice farming. So most of it was converted to farmland. There was a lot of ranch land and still is, especially when you get closer to the coast. There's a large ranching heritage of grazing cattle down in the salt marsh and on the barrier islands. Very humid to subtropic, especially when you get down into the lower Rio Grande Valley. It's subtropical in nature. From a geological standpoint, this is our youngest ecoregion in the state from a geological timeline. And it's probably also our most altered, not only because most of it's converted to farming or improved grasslands, but it also has the huge petrochemical industry. So we have a lot of chemical plants and urbanization that goes along with it. And a lot of large cities, Corpus, Houston, Beaumont, Port Arthur. Some of the issues we see here is freshwater inflows are huge to maintaining our biological diversity and reproduction of some of our important finfish and invertebrates like spotted sea trout, redfish, shrimp, blue crab. They depend on freshwater inflows from the major rivers, Colorado, Brazos, Guadalupe, whatnot, for enough freshwater in the bays for them to reproduce. And on the flip side of that, we have what's called the Laguna Madre, which is a shallow inlet between Corpus and Brownsville. And it's considered a hypersaline ecosystem. So it's actually more salty than the ocean, and it's the largest, I believe it's the largest hypersaline ecosystem in the world. And because we have tall grass prairie, freshwater marshes, saltwater marshes, different bays that are more fresh, hypersaline bays, barrier islands, beaches, we have a huge diversity of plants and animals, especially on the animal side, birds and the fish. So the Gulf Coast Plains has a lot going on for it as far as different ecoregions within it, but we'll start when you get off of, so we'll start with the barrier islands. So when you divide up the coast from Corpus on south, it's pretty much the Laguna Madre and just a narrow strip of Padre Island. So this down here is very salty, not a lot of freshwater inflows. When you get between Corpus and up towards Galveston or Bolivar Peninsula, this part of the state is dependent on freshwater inflows. This is where we see all our large bay ecosystems: Galveston Bay, Matagorda Bay, Corpus Bay, Aransas Bay, San Antonio Bay, Lavaca Bay. And so this is where we see a lot of our bay type ecosystems. And then our barrier islands along here would be San Jose Island, Mustang Island, Matagorda Island, Galveston Island. And then once you get north of Bolivar Peninsula and Galveston and over into up towards Beaumont and into Louisiana, this is you'll hear people call this the Texas-Louisiana coastal marshes. There's also some other names out there for it. But basically, there's no really barrier bay islands and barrier systems in this part of the state. So when the water flows out of the rivers in the watersheds in this part of the state and over into Louisiana, it doesn't go into a bay and then into an ocean. So like Guadalupe River, down around between Houston and Corpus, Guadalupe River flows into Guadalupe Bay. The Colorado River flows into Matagorda Bay and so on and so forth. When you get up here around Beaumont into Louisiana, the water just flows through the marsh directly into the ocean for the most part. So you see this transitional marsh that goes from very wet, very fresh to kind of salty to brackish into the salt water. So it's a very important marsh ecosystem. So when we move inland and we're looking at the coastal plains, we'll just start from Brownsville and go on up. Down around Valsville is the lower Rio Grande Valley. So it's actually a very broad floodplain that is great for farming, and they use the Rio Grande River for irrigation. So this is where we see a lot of our vegetable production in the state, and this is where we see all our oranges and citrus and onions and stuff like that. But down right along the river, the Rio Grande River is where you see a lot of, like, we have palm forest down there, so stuff that you would not see anywhere outside anywhere else in America. Once you start moving up towards Corpus, you get into this 34D, which is the coastal sand plain. It's basically stabilized sand dunes that blew in off the Gulf of Mexico. This is pretty much all located within the Keene Ranch. So if you ever travel through the Keene Ranch, you're traveling through stabilized sand dunes, or if you ever go down 77 between Corpus and Brownsville. Then when you move on further up the coast, get around Corpus, you get into historically would have been more of a mid-grass prairie. There is some farming around here, but a lot of this area is too arid and we overgraze it too easily. So it's been converted into shrubland. And then once you get around up between Victoria and Houston and on over to Beaumont, this is really where we see a lot of our good farmland in the state. It's where we see rice production's dominant. And then there is some ranching. It is note that this is, like I said, a narrow strip. When you get up here around Beaumont, you can see this is only about 15 miles between the Gulf of Mexico and when you get into the Piney Woods. And then at its broadest point, I think it's about 75 miles or so between the Gulf of Mexico and north up here around Houston. But the last thing to point out is this 34C. So we have this, what we call the Brazoria bottomlands down here. And it's an important habitat for not only because it's a forest habitat for reptiles and amphibians and stuff that go along with the forest, but it's the only spot along the Gulf of Mexico, along the western Gulf of Mexico, where we have forests directly touching the Gulf of Mexico. So when neotropical birds migrate from the eastern seaboard, they come down to like around Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and then they jet across the Gulf of Mexico. And they hit this is the first forest that they hit. So they rely on this Brazoria bottomlands for them to refuel themselves, basically, to continue on down to Central and South America. They basically, once they migrate nonstop, obviously a little bird, a little wobbler or hummingbird or whatnot, can't stop and land in the Gulf of Mexico. So when they get to these Brazoria bottomlands, they're pretty much completely depleted of their resources and they're just feathers and skin and bones. So they rely on this Brazoria bottomland to refuel themselves. So quick pictures of all the diversity. When you're in the mid-coast, you see a lot of Spartina marsh, which is kind of representative of brackish areas that get a lot of freshwater inflow. When you talk to fishery biologists, and so they kind of consider this almost to being as diverse as some of the coral reef type estuary ecosystems. These Spartina marsh is where all our important finfish and crustaceans that our fishermen rely on Texas coast reproduce. This is a picture of Laguna Madre and eelgrass that grows in it, and it's important for redhead ducks because about 95% of the redhead ducks winter in the Laguna Madre and feed exclusively on this grass. Just a picture of a typical barrier island and sand dunes. Then when we move further inland, we see tallgrass prairie made up of little bluestem mostly. This would be a upper saltgrass prairie that typically doesn't get inundated with salt water except during a very high tide or during a hurricane. And then here's a picture bottom right is Brazoria bottomlands, which are marked by these very large live oak trees. Like I said, plant diversity is huge in this part of the state. So you see all kind of different wildflowers, milkweed, wild dill, all kind of different wild sunflowers and rosinweed, indigos, and Indian plantain, to name a few. Bird diversity is up there. We'll just start, because there's obviously stuff on here more than birds. Top left is a picture I took when I worked for Parks and Wildlife in Palacios. I did not know until I started working in Palacios that Texas actually is home to land crabs. This is a pretty large land crab. You can see he's in a fairly large cooler, and they don't actually have to rely on water except for reproduction. So you'll find them 5-6 miles inland from the water. Kind of creepy looking. I've never seen a land crab before in my life. We do have greater prairie chickens, would have been very common throughout this region. Now they're just left pretty much on a few preserves we have left. I think they only number in the few hundred. Sea turtles, we have 5 sea turtle species here in Texas. They're all protected. Some are a lot more common, like green sea turtles are very common in our bay systems. This would be a Kent Ridley sea turtle, which is one of the more highly protected ones, but they come nest on Texas beaches. Black skimmers, we see all kind of wading birds and shorebirds. Like I said, the Texas Gulf Coast is home to a lot of important, it's important for a wintering habitat for a lot of waterfowl. In this picture, we have pintail flying off the water, and then this is all redhead ducks on the water. And then, like I said, all kind of neotropical migrants like this orchard oriole, which is depend on the woodlands like in the Columbia bottomlands to complete their migration. And then last but certainly not least, you can't talk about the Gulf without talking about all the fish. So we got all kind of weird fish, from flounder to redfish, which a lot of people like to catch, black drum, sheep's head, whiting, croaker, and then some of the odd ones. I think this is a type of blenny, if I'm not mistaken. And then one of my personal favorites, gosh, dog, I can't even think what they're called right now, but you can see this guy's really weird looking. And for the life of me, I can't think what they're called. So to wrap all this up, if I was in person, I'd ask the group to talk about what do they think is the most biological diverse ecoregions in Texas. And this is 100% on my opinion, and just my opinion alone, not really any kind of, I guess you could say, literature behind it, just my opinion alone. But the red circles are what I'm thinking, what I personally think are some of the most biological diverse regions in the state. The southeast part of the piney woods, where we get into the longleaf pine savanna and the big thicket. Down along the coast, especially that mid-coast area between Houston and Galveston down to Corpus and the Columbia bottomlands and the tallgrass prairie that's left down there, and the barrier islands. South Texas and the lower Rio Grande Valley with all their species that are found nowhere else in America because they reach their northern limit in South Texas. That Edwards Plateau Hill Country area, specifically the Balconians Canyonlands, because of all the Texas endemics found in the springs and the aquifers and rivers in that part of the state. And then lastly, the Trans-Pecos and the Sky Islands and the mountain ranges out in far west Texas, because of all the species that are found either in northern Mexico or in the Rocky Mountains that are found in this part of the state. And then for my last slide is the green X's. I'd ask the group to talk about what ecoregions they think are the most imperiled or are the most, most endangered, I guess you could say, and the ones that are the most intact to represent what they historically look like before we settled Texas. The red X's are the most imperiled. The Gulf Coastal Plain, because of all the farming and urbanization. The Backland Prairie, where they say less than 1% of the prairies left because of, again, all the urbanization and farming. The rolling plains, specifically the eastern part and the central Great Plains, because it's a huge farming area and because a lot of it's been overgrazed and no longer a grassland, but converted to shrubland. And then the high plains or the llano estacado, again, because of oil and gas, farming, and some growth from Lubbock and Amarillo. And then the most intact parts, I would say, would be the post oak savanna, because most of that was left as farmland and there's not too many large cities in there. The cross timbers, because most of that was left as ranch land. And then again, in the Southwest Tablelands, again, because most of it was left as ranch land. So if you caught that, I was trying to go for a trend there. Some of our most endangered or imperiled ecoregions in Texas, and I'm not knocking farming at all. I mean, I grew up on a cotton farm. It has its place, and I'm into farming as it is. But are ecoregions that have been converted to farmland and urbanization. And then some of our most intact ecoregions are left are the ones that are outside of the major urban areas and the ones that didn't have the soil to support farming. So they've been left as ranch land. So that has left a lot of our animals and a lot of our plants intact that support our animals. So with that, I guess that wraps that all up. And if I was in person, I would take questions. And thanks for joining for my road trip across Texas. If y'all have any questions, y'all can always contact me. My office number is 936-327-6828. And my email is matthew.march@ag.tamu.edu. And you spell that out, MATTHEW.MARCH@ag.tamu.edu.